Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, That Dead Girl, and if this is your first time joining me, basically what I do here is I sit down with you all and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. And if you've been keeping tabs on all things Infamous Indie, be sure to check out part 4 of the Sylvia Likens story. And I just posted another video, Orville Lynn Majors, The Angel of Death. Be sure to check that out as well. This week I'm going to be doing a fan requested story actually. This story was told to me by my friend Nate. So I'm going to be giving you guys a bit of a history lesson today. We're going to go all the way back to 1925 and we're going to be talking about a woman named Madge Oberholtzer. Madge Augustine Oberholtzer was born in 1896 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Madge was born to German-American parents and spent most of her life residing in the Irvington area. Madge's father was a postal clerk, and the family often attended church at Irvington Methodist. Madge attended Butler College in Irvington, and she studied quite a few different things during her time there. It said that she studied English, mathematics, zoology, and even logic. Madge would later go on to drop out during her junior year, and she never really gave a reason why. Madge would go on to be pretty successful in her own right. She would actually go on to become the manager of the Indiana Young People's Reading Circle. So basically, this was a program that was put forth to basically encourage young people to read more. And it was actually a very special section of the Indiana Department of Public Instruction. This program would basically reward certification to any young student who completed the course of readings that was put forth by the board of directors. So Madge had worked with this organization for quite some time, but there came a point where she had started to hear rumors that the program had actually lost its funding and her job was in jeopardy. So during this time, Madge really just tried to set out on her own and make new connections and obviously try to find some new source of employment. On January 12, 1925, Madge actually had the opportunity to attend Governor Jackson's inauguration ball at the Indiana Athletics Club. And as I said, Madge was basically branching out and trying to make new contacts and get new leads for employment. And on this night, she would actually go on to meet a man named D.C. Stevenson. Now, D.C. Stevenson was actually one of the most powerful men in Indiana during this time. By the age of 33, D.C. Stevenson was known to be a political power broker who also moonlighted as the Grand Dragon for the KKK. It said that D.C. controlled the governor's election and all of the movements of several different state legislators. He would go on to influence bills on steam pollution, highways, nutrition, all of which would subsequently line his own pockets. DC's political success was directly tied to his leadership role with the KKK. And just to kind of put into perspective for you the amount of power that he actually had, in 1925, in the state of Indiana alone, there were about 250,000 members of the KKK. And that was about 30% of the white male population in Indiana during that time. So Madge and D.C. meet at this banquet and they're talking, they're getting along pretty well. And D.C. actually asks Madge out on a date that very night. But obviously Madge being a lady, and this is a man that she had just met, she didn't really know that well, she declined his offer. So after this banquet, they kind of kept in contact, or I guess more so, DC kept trying to pursue Madge. He kept on, he was very persistent, and eventually she kind of caved in and agreed to go to dinner with him. And as you can kind of start to see, DC Stevenson was definitely a man who did not like to be told no. After the dinner date, I'm assuming things went kind of okay for them, and DC still was on this pursuit of Madge. He kept calling, kept leaving word for her, and she kind of was blowing him off initially, but eventually agreed to go to dinner with him yet again, this time at the Washington Hotel. The two ended up seeing each other more frequently, and actually DC Stevenson would go on to offer Madge a job. D.C. hired Madge basically as an aide for him during the 1925 Indiana General Assembly. Basically, Madge would deliver messages, handle paperwork, arrange seating, basically anything that D.C. needed her to do, she did. The two would also pair up and end up writing a book together called 100 Years of Health, and it was Madge's wish to actually help DC get this book published and to sell it to school libraries and other places throughout the state. All was well for the two, but then suddenly Madge kind of decided to end her relationship, working and personal, with DC Stevenson, seemingly out of nowhere. It's said that the decision came about for her after she attended one of DC Stevenson's infamous parties. And I guess DC Stevenson was really known for the parties that he would throw. Some would be black tie events that would be very classy, and then others were just said to be full of orgies and just straight up debauchery. So I'm going to assume that Madge had actually seen one of these parties where all this crazy shit was going on, and that kind of put a bad taste in her mouth, and she did not want to be associated with a man like that. And just to give you a little bit of background on this DC Stevenson dude, at this point in time, he's been arrested before for indecent exposure. He actually exposed himself to a woman and her child in a public place and was arrested for that. There had also been several reports of women coming forward with these stories that DC Stevenson had actually sexually assaulted them. But needless to say, obviously all of this stuff went to the wayside simply because of who DC Stevenson was. So Madge cuts all ties with DC after this party or whatever, and he still continues to pursue her. On March 15th, 1925, Madge was returning home. She had gone out to dinner with some friends, and when she got home, her mother had told her that DC Stevenson's secretary had left a message for her saying that she needed to contact DC right away, that it was very urgent. So for whatever reason, Madge ends up calling DC, and the two begin to talk, and basically he makes an offer. He actually offers to revive the reading program that Madge had managed before, but only if she agreed to go to dinner with him one last time before he left for Chicago. Madge reluctantly agreed to meet with him, and so she changed her clothes, and shortly thereafter she was picked up by one of DC Stevenson's drivers, and he's only referred to as Mr. Gentry. So Mr. Gentry drives Madge to DC Stevenson's mansion, which is actually only a few blocks away from her own home. Obviously, Madge was a very intelligent woman, so on the drive over to the mansion, she just kind of began to feel very uneasy. When she arrived at the mansion, she was greeted at the door by DC and yet another bodyguard. From there, DC and his two bodyguards would lead Madge into his kitchen. And it's then that things really began to escalate. The three men proceeded to hold Madge down, and they actually forced alcohol down her throat multiple times until the point where she was actually vomiting. DC then pulled out a revolver and stuck it to Madge's back and forced her to walk towards his garage. And from there, DC and these two men would actually force Madge into the back seat of the car. And just before they left, DC told one of the bodyguards that actually stayed behind to leave word with his secretary and let them know that he was actually going to Chicago for some type of business meeting. So I'm guessing with that, he was basically just trying to establish some sort of alibi. So Madge is begging, pleading, making up any excuse she can think of to get these men to take her home. She did not want to go anywhere with them at this point, but obviously the men refused. They arrived at Union Station, and the two men would actually force Madge to walk and get into DC Stevenson's private train car. Things began to take a really violent turn as soon as they entered this train car and the door was closed behind them. It's said that DC grabbed the bottom of Madge's dress and actually lifted it up over her head to where she couldn't see anything. He then grabbed her hands and forced her down and began to rape her repeatedly on this train car. It said that he also began viciously biting Madge on several different parts of her body. And at this point, Madge had, been forced to drink alcohol, a lot of it, so she's very intoxicated. She's very weak and she's being overpowered, and eventually she just passes out. At some point, Madge actually does wake up, and at that point, she actually begins to confront DC. She actually screams at him, the law is going to get their hands on you. And DC, being the type of man he is, with all of his political and Klansman power, he simply just looks at her and tells her, honey, I am the law in Indiana. There's basically nothing you can do. So mind you, all of this has taken place within his private train car. Now they will be going on to their next location in Hammond, Indiana. They still have Madge. They've basically kidnapped her at this point. So DC instructs his bodyguard, Mr. Gentry, to dress Madge, and they would prepare to go to the next location. So the three of them check into the Indiana hotel, and DC actually forced Madge to lie and tell the clerk that they were married in order for them to be able to sleep in the same room together. And as you can imagine, when they did finally get upstairs into the room, several hours of more abuse and more sexual assault occurred until D.C. Stevenson passed out. And while D.C. Stevenson slept, Madge lay next to him in the bed, frozen in fear. At some point, Madge looks down, and then she actually noticed that D.C. was carrying a revolver on his hip. She actually had thought about grabbing the revolver with the intent of killing herself. But in the end, I guess she ultimately decided against it for fear that she would dishonor her mother by doing so. So instead of killing herself, she began to formulate a plan and put it into action. So the next morning, she basically kind of used her womanly charms. Obviously, DC was in love with her, obsessed with her, etc. So she kind of sweet talks him, and she convinces him to call a car for her so that she can go into town and buy a new silk hat. So the driver takes her into town, she purchases the hat, and on the way back from purchasing the hat, she actually convinces the driver to take her to a drugstore, and she lies and says that she needs to purchase some rouge. So she obviously purchases the rouge and some other makeup, but then she also purchases something else. She had also purchased a box of mercury bichloride tablets. So obviously this is way back in the day. Mercury bichloride tablets is not something that we as humans can consume anymore, but back then it was used for several things, like a antiseptic, a pesticide. I mean, and sometimes it was even used to induce abortion. So obviously not something that's safe for human consumption. Very poisonous. Basically, when swallowed, these tablets or this chemical, it's corrosive to the mucous membranes. So Madge had decided to actually poison herself in an attempt to get DC to either A, take her to the hospital, or B, she would just die. So Madge returns to the hotel room. She actually goes on to consume about 6 of these mercury bichloride tablets. Even though she had the intention of taking all 18, she could only get down 6 because they were burning the insides of her mouth. Shortly thereafter, the effects of the poison had began to take hold of Madge, and she actually spent most of the day vomiting up blood. So DC Stevenson is pissed the fuck off at this point. He's freaking the fuck out, and he basically refuses to take Madge to the hospital to get her help unless she agrees to go to a nearby chapel and marry him. So Madge obviously refused, and as her condition began to worsen, DC began to panic. So much so that he instructed his driver to put Madge in the car, and they were going to take her back to Indianapolis. So obviously people took notice of this odd behavior. Madge is sick, she's weak, she's bruised and beaten. People are asking, oh my gosh, what's wrong with her? And DC Stevenson basically just tells them she was in a car accident, and nobody thought any different, like I said, because of who DC Stevenson was. Now, back in Irvington, Madge's parents are very worried because it was very unlike Madge to not come home like for an entire night. So they went to Union Station in hopes that they might see her getting on or off a train. Obviously, as we know, she's not on a train, so her parents had no luck. Now, while her parents were out, D.C. Stevenson had this Mr. Gentry guy actually take Madge back to her home, carry her into the house and upstairs, and put her in her bed. And basically, he just left her there to die. So eventually, Madge's parents actually return home, and she kind of is telling them what happened. Clearly, they can see something's wrong, so they immediately seek medical attention for her. I mean, and sadly, at this point, there wasn't really a whole lot that could be done for Madge. The doctor basically just pumped her stomach and kind of waited around to see if her condition would improve. The doctor noticed and took note of the fact that Madge had several injuries to her body. Apparently, she had, bruises all over her face, all over different parts of her body. And she had these several, like, open wounds on her chest, her breast, her ankles, her back, like, just all over her body. And actually, these wounds that she had were later determined to be bite wounds. And remember, I said while he was assaulting her, he actually did bite into her flesh several times. So basically, as Madge lay on her deathbed, her parents were actually smart enough to have a lawyer come to the house to take down Madge's statement word for word. The lawyer, Asa Smith, she would go on to take it to the appropriate people, and news spread fast about Madge and her condition and what had gone down between her and D.C. Stevenson. But sadly, Madge would actually go on to pass away almost a month later, actually, after the attack. And it said that the injuries that she sustained and even the poisoning were the cause of her death. An autopsy was obviously later conducted, and it was determined that Madge had actually died from a staph infection from the wounds all over her body, and kidney failure as well, and that was due to the mercury bichloride tablets, the poisoning. D.C. Stevenson would actually go on to be indicted on charges of rape and second-degree murder. The doctor who examined Madge's body actually determined that the wounds alone that she sustained from this attack would have been enough to kill her because it did cause that staph infection, and that infection had actually spread to her lungs. DC's attorney was adamant that Madge Oberholtzer had actually committed suicide and that DC Stevenson had no way of knowing she would do something like that. The prosecution argued that, Madge's life could have been saved had DC Stevenson not prolonged getting her medical attention. Basically, prompt medical attention could have and probably would have saved Madge's life. The jury would go on to find D.C. Stevenson guilty of rape, kidnapping, and second-degree murder. D.C. Stevenson was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes against Madge Oberholtzer. And this is kind of where it starts to get interesting because this was a highly publicized case even for 1925. So upon all these Klansmen, I guess, hearing about what D.C. Stevenson had done, they were actually disgusted by his behavior. I mean, so much so that entire lodges had quit en masse. And, their memberships or whatever dropped, instantly by tens of thousands. And then over the next 2 years, the Klan would go on to lose up to 178,000 members, basically almost eradicating them completely. So, DC, being the charming, great man that he was, while he was in prison in an attempt to, I guess, get probably time cuts and things like that, he began to talk. He gave a local newspaper, actually, several names of political figures and other prominent figures who had actually taken bribes and payments from the KKK. And from that, the state of Indiana actually went on to indict, several prominent politicians and other people in the state of Indiana. This investigation actually shed a lot of light on just the corruption that was happening during this time period. And when it was all said and done, the Indiana Klan rosters dropped from like 250,000 members down to just 4,000 within that 2-year time period. D.C. Stevenson was actually paroled on March 23rd, 1980, and he would actually later go on to violate his parole because he would disappear later that year, I think in September. He was actually captured in Indianapolis in December of that same year and was actually ordered to serve another 10 years in prison. D.C. Stevenson was paroled again in December of 1956 on the condition that he leave Indiana and never ever return. In 1961, D.C. Stevenson would go on to be arrested again, and this time he was accused of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old girl. And at this time, he was 70 years old. So those charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, and D.C. Stevenson would actually go on to pass away 5 years later at the age of 75. And basically, that is the story of how Madge Oberholtzer pretty much single-handedly almost wiped out the entire KKK population in the state of Indiana. You know, I think it's pretty crazy. She saved the lives of so many people. I mean, sadly, by sacrificing her own. But it's like, it's still huge to me because this man actually had plans to run for president, and with the amount of people he had at that time backing him, he probably would have won. And could you even just imagine where we would be now had this psycho racist hillbilly ended up being, you know, the president of the United States? Basically, Madge Oberholtzer, you was a bad bitch, and, you know, the lady fought the dragon, and in the end, she won in her own way. Thank you guys for sitting down with me and listening to my little history lesson, if you will. As I said before in the beginning of the video, make sure that you definitely check out part 4 of the Sylvia Likens story, and also the Orville Lynn Major story. I have that up for you guys as well. And the next thing that I will be working on is my piece on the disappearance of Lauren Spearer. As always, do not forget to like and subscribe. And if you like what I do here at Infamous Indie, please always feel free to share my content, especially with other people who love true crime as much as I do. And remember to stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back out there because it's a crazy fucking world.